All right. Good morning, everybody. We're going to start here in about a minute or so. Give just a couple minutes for any kind of late arrivals jumping in. So we'll start here in just a few minutes. Hey, I think we're going to just go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on Employee Handbooks 101, why they're important and why they're important to small business owners, those kind of things. Just real quick, some housekeeping things. I'm going to turn over to Sherry because there's a lot of information in this webinar. Just so you know, there is a Q&A section. If you see at the top of your screen, there's a Q&A button and there's a chat button. As you have questions, please go ahead and throw those in there. Hopefully, maybe towards the end, we'll have some time, as usual. Normally have about maybe 5-10 minutes, maybe, to do some live Q&As. But if you guys put your questions in there, we'll try and answer them as we go along. And we'll try to get to those. It doesn't matter whether you put them in the chat or the Q&A. We'll see both of them and try and get them answered for you in those areas. We will be doing after, as a follow-up, once the webinar is done, as usual, we will be sending out consolidated Q&As of all the questions that are asked during the webinar, and probably some other ones we're going to throw in there just for good measure, because we know there are things that probably won't come to mind while we're here, but things that we still want to address. And then we'll also send that out. We'll send out a copy of the slide deck of the presentation to everybody. And then there also is a recording of the meeting that we'll make available for everybody as well. If you have problems, we've had some issues in the past trying to get to the recording. If you have problems with that, reach out, let us know. We'll put that probably out on our YouTube channel as well, so you can view it there. Sometimes Teams is a little finicky on what it allows people to do or not do, what they access or not access. So we'll try and take care of you guys. But either way, a lot of stuff to cover on Employee Handbooks. So I am going to turn this over to Sherry and let her get started, and we'll just kind of work our way through it. So Sherry, it's all yours.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for sending it over to me. I think I have a little bit of a technical difficulty. I don't know if you all can see me or not. I guess it doesn't matter, but can you? Okay.
Yeah, we got you.
Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Employee Handbooks 101, everything you wanted to know, and probably a lot of stuff you don't necessarily want to know either about employee handbooks. And so let's go ahead and dig in. First, we're going to talk about really, why do employee handbooks matter? And then we're going to talk about different things to consider when writing your employee handbooks. What types of components in employee handbooks make excellent handbooks? And how do you keep up on all of that stuff with the employee handbooks? And then if we have time at the end, not only are we going to be maybe taking some questions, but we have some trending HR topics that we're kind of watching out for. And we kind of just want to give you all a heads up on that information. So, why employee handbooks matter? There's several reasons that employee handbooks are good for your organization. Legally, they are not required, whatsoever. There are no federal or state laws that require you to have a handbook. However, there are federal and state laws that require you to let your employees know the different laws and regulations that might be related to them in employment for them. And so the handbook has kind of come about as one of those easy compliance things excuse me, that you can do to make sure that your employees are in the know and that they have all of the needed information. And handbooks provide the centralized information. It should be pretty much a living, breathing document that is continually updated in your organization. It covers things like benefits, company perks, administrative procedures, what type of behavior and conduct you want them to have. And so um, it's good for putting all of that in one place that can find what they need if they go to that employee handbook. It assists you with onboarding and culture of your organization. And as you know, when you hire someone new, there's a lot of time you end up spending with them administratively anyway, trying to get them set up in systems, trying to get them, how do you do your time card, those type of situations. But employee handbooks allows you to give them part of the responsibility to learn your policies and sometimes procedures. It gives them an opportunity to look at your handbook and decide, make some decisions. Is this like a warm welcoming company? Is this a company that's more structured to be more professional or more laid back? It kind of gives them an insight into your organization. It provides them with clarity on your expectations. What are they specifically supposed to handle when it comes to employee duties? What are the standards of conduct that you have for them? Even down to how do I dress or where do I park? And so those things are super important. And this will give them an opportunity to learn that as they're going through their handbook. And lastly, maybe not lastly, but importantly, it promotes consistency and fairness. As long as you are using that, you're ensuring the rules are being, appropriate and uniform throughout your organization, no matter where you're at, whether you're in one location or 10 different locations, you can have fairness and consistency throughout because everything is lined out in your policy manual. But the number one reason why employee handbooks matter is due to legal protection and compliance. Um, that is going to be your number one way to defend yourself if you do get a disgruntled employee of any kind that tries to file a lawsuit against you. It's used as evidence in almost every employment related lawsuit. And while it doesn't necessarily cause the lawsuit, it will be used for good and the opposite way if it's not a good handbook that can prove that you were maybe discriminating or you had inconsistent treatment or if there were wage and hour violations. Just to throw a few statistics at you, 40% of small business owners reported facing employee lawsuits in 2024. That's almost half of small business owners in the United States. That's a pretty big statistic.
So Sherry, if we're looking at that, just if we take just a small sample, right, of just the attendees for this. So essentially approximately 18 of our attendees would be in technically in a lawsuit, would have some sort of employee lawsuit going on. And the handbook could really factor into those lawsuits
Yeah, handbook could,
tremendously.
weigh very heavily in protecting your business. Or if you don't really have a good handbook, it could go against you too. So it is primarily used as evidence in lawsuits. And so it is super important to have.
Yeah, that's
Um,
crazy.
in 2025, just a few more statistics to let you know why employee handbooks matter. Um, across the United States, just for discrimination, there were over 26,000 lawsuits filed. There were almost 7,000 cases for disability accommodations that were filed. There were 4,700 cases that were filed in the United States over FEMLA issues, which is the Federal Medical Leave Act. And then there were over 5,700 cases filed for wage and hours issues. And so, it's a pretty big deal across the United States. I don't personally have the Missouri numbers and how many of these were in Missouri, but either way, it's pretty overwhelming when you look at just how often this is happening. Um, One thing that we want to talk about and point out are the federal and state mandates for compliance. And as you may know, there are laws that are set up with the Fair Labor Standards Act that are federal, and all employers in the United States fall under the Federal Labor Standards Act. But on top of that, you also have different states that are passing laws and regulations as well. And it can be a bit confusing. In last year, 2025, there were 21 states and 48 different localities that updated their minimum wage alone. That was their changes. That was pretty expansive to keep up with. On top of that, paid leave was expanded into 13 states, and 25 states introduced specific AI regulations. And when you're trying to figure out what is important for you to think about and what is important for you to follow, it gets real easy. I'm gonna say real easy. It's easier if everybody that you have and your business is located in one state, but we're moving into a new workforce, a new generation where there's a lot of remote workers. And so not only do you have to be concerned about making sure that you're following the federal and state mandates for your state, but you have to start looking at, if you have an employee in a different state, what does their state mandates regulate? What things do you have to worry about on that side of things too? So it kind of all comes together and can be very confusing at times. When we talk about the federal and state mandates, usually they come with thresholds, meaning how many employees do I have to have before this law takes effect? And for some laws, it takes effect with just one employee. A lot of OSHA laws are like that as well. But some laws may take effect at 15 employees, 20 employees, 50, 100. I've even seen 300 employees in some cases. And we see those as pretty round numbers, but states like to get a little crazy too at times. So like just recently in Washington, the Parental and Pregnancy Leave Act took place and took effect if you have 8 or more employees. As we saw last year with the Missouri sick leave law that was repealed, there were different parts of that law. So if you had a certain number of employees, you were required to have 40 hours of paid sick leave. If you had, I think it was over 15 employees, then you were required to have 56 hours of paid sick leave. So thresholds change with each law. Thresholds change with each federal law and state law. And sometimes there's different mandates in there. So you have to be aware of those. The other thing that changes for states pretty often is how you count employees. And I wish this was something that was standardized across the board. Unfortunately, it's not. Pretty much the only standardization that you have out there is that you don't include independent contractors. And that's because they're not considered employees. But some laws, they'll tell you right out. They'll say, well, it's a simple head count. Do you have X number of employees either this year or last year? And did you have them for 20 weeks? And 20 weeks doesn't necessarily have to be 20 consecutive weeks. It could just be 20 weeks overall within the year. Sometimes laws will just count full-time employees. Sometimes they'll count, part-time employees, but not temporary employees. And sometimes it's just an annual average of employees that they're going to look at. So sometimes you just really have to pay attention to different laws. Some states also do not tend to specify how to count employees for laws, and they have to come up with interpretations later. And we kind of learned that a little bit last year with the sick leave law, that it wasn't written well and that left a lot of room for interpretation. Well, New York, if you have employees in New York right now, or your business is New York, you're kind of dealing with that right now, as you have to kind of wait on an interpretation of that law and how that's going to roll out for their sick leave, because they're wanting your employees in New York, all of those across the nation to count for if you're based in there. So it really is a matter of reading a law carefully and knowing exactly what they're looking for in that.
Sherry, real quick before you move on though.
Yeah.
So there, most HR people know this, should know this. Um, but for knowing these things that are federally mandated, some state obviously mandated stuff, there are posters and things like other resources that they have to have in their shop, right? They need to have it somewhere, posted somewhere in their building, in their organization somewhere. Do we have like resources of vendors and things like that that we could like include in the, we'll put in the Q&A or something along those lines, but like there are places they can go get those, right?
Oh, yeah. That is one really nice way of keeping up with all the laws in your state and federal laws and states that you may have remote employees in is subscribing to poster vendor companies that will send out new posters every time a law is updated or a law is enacted in a state that you somehow have a presence in. There's several different vendors out there. Compliance poster company might be one that you would use, and it's just basically a subscription. And they'll just send you new posters every single time. Poster Guard is another popular one that you can subscribe with, and the Labor Law Compliance Center is another one that's really popular. It's an easier way to keep track of those things. And as you know, not only do you have to have these things if you're having an employee handbook, you should have these things in there. But a lot of times those posters are completely mandated. So you're always needing to update your posters and your in those centralized locations where everybody's going to see those. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Different things to note also about federal and state compliances is understanding key dates when these laws take effect. And I hate to, it'd be nice if they made it easy for us. It would be nice if they were all taking place at the same time, but unfortunately they do not. We know that the start of the calendar year and the start of the fiscal year are usually the most common, and that's January 1st, July 1st. A lot of those are being enacted because maybe there are reserved for standalone laws or specific changes that they're trying to address. And then if laws are being updated regularly, usually they're going to be on notable dates. And my example of that would be minimum wage. Most states try to limit those to specific times of the year, probably at the beginning of a quarter or either on those start dates of the fiscal or the calendar year. There are states that do update at different times in the middle of the year and some principalities that do that as well. So you just have to be aware of that. Some states have their own set calendar for when changes occur, and that makes it a little bit more difficult unless you're based in that state and you know what their typical start dates are. For example, Utah just started prohibiting a non-compete agreement for healthcare workers, and it started on May 6th, which is just a very random day for something like that to start. And then Illinois did a family neonatal intensive care leave act that's going to take place on June the 1st. So it's not at the beginning of a fiscal quarter or anything like that. It's just kind of a random date. And then Washington is going to start something on June 11th that restricts microchip implantation for employees. And so again, every state may have their own starting dates on these laws.
Hang on a second, Sherry.
Yes.
Microchipping employees.
Yeah, that's kind
Or
of scary, isn't it?
This is serious, right? This is not like
This is serious. Yeah, actually, Washington put in a law that said that employees can be voluntarily microchipped, and they want to do this to make things easier for security, maybe clocking in and out, those type of things. But they put a ban and said that, if it's not voluntary, you cannot enforce that regulation among employees. You can't make an employee get microchipped, that type of thing. So, and that takes place on June 11th. So I don't really know what happens until June 11th when the ban starts. It seems a little crazy to me, but yeah,
wow.
yeah,
Okay.
that's a real thing. Yeah.
Okay, so can we come back to the non-compete just for a minute?
Uh-huh.
The where do we stand? Because I know about a year or two ago, California was a big proponent in trying to get rid of the non-competes, saying they weren't legal to have them or what have you. Where do we stand? And where I know there are some Supreme Court decisions made, or they're at least they're hearing it. Where does it really stand on non-competes? Because again, what happens, either side, East Coast, West Coast, it's going to end up here eventually. But on a national level, did they strike it down? Where does that really
Yeah.
stand?
The Supreme Court struck down the ban on non-competes. They didn't think it was constitutional. They thought there was a lot of wiggle room in there between states and even just between different industries and the amount of knowledge a person would have. You're not going to want to impose a non-compete on somebody who's an hourly worker who may not have a lot of access to company information or company skill in certain areas. So the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. But what that did do was kind of spark a lot of states to develop their own non-compete laws. And we'll get into this a little bit later, and I can give you a little statistics, but there are many states that have their own specialized non-compete laws that lay out standards for their particular state that you have to look at. But as a nation federally, they were not, it didn't fly. So,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah.
More
Yeah.
to come.
Yeah, more to
on that,
come.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And for some states, just on this last key dates and understanding those, the effective date is like a set number of days after passage of a law. And we saw this I would say like a year ago with the Missouri sick leave. Once that was signed, the repeal was signed into law. It was just a set number of days after that things took place and that was into effect. So it was like August 28th. So again, I don't want to confuse anybody, but I do want you to know that different states have different laws and times that these things take effect, and you just have to really stay on top of that. So for considerations when you're writing your handbook, first thing you want to think about is deciding the tone. What would a new employee think about how it's written? Is it more administrative or is it more welcoming? Are you talking to them, in first person? You're talking to them in third person. Years ago, you'd only write something like this in third person, but with the new generations in the workforce, they tend to be a bit more lax and they tend to want to see things in first person or even second person because they connect with it easier. You can move back and forth in your handbook on your tone, depending on what you're working on and what your culture wants to be. But it is important to think about that ahead of time as you're getting ready to write your handbook. Make sure that it's easy to read and understand. You don't want to add a bunch of legalese information. Unfortunately, the average reading level is a fourth grade reading level throughout the United States. And so if you put in a lot of big words, people are not going to understand. And that kind of defeats the purpose of making the handbook and writing the handbook. You want your employees to have a good understanding of what they're reading and know how to interpret those things.
Sure, I just
Be
have to. Can I pause you just for a
Yes.
second? I hate to interrupt you, but Heather, that your comment, your Q&A. No, EDP is not going to start offering microchips instead of regular time clocks.
Oh,
Promise you that.
no.
And I think it'd be, given the normal temperament of Missouri, I think it would be a long time coming before it would even be something Missourians would consider. But I couldn't let that go without addressing that. That's just,
No.
I love that.
No,
Thank you,
I'm
Heather.
not
I
for
love that.
that at all. Yeah.
Love that. Absolutely.
All right. Going on in considerations for your handbooks, be transparent in your policies. You do not have to address every little thing, but you do want to make sure that you get the important things of laws and mandates in there, things that might come into question that you don't necessarily want wiggle room on. Um, Make sure that you're spelling it out. Make sure you work on a limit. If your handbook's 100 pages long, it is way too long. Nobody's going to sit and read a 100-page manual unless maybe your employees are very professional and they're go-getters and they want to know every little detail. It's just overwhelming and it can get to be too big. So you don't want to you don't want to make everything too crazy and go overboard on it either. And not only will it be hard for them to read, but updating it would be a little crazy as well. And you don't need a policy for everything. And sometimes, especially if we have a situation in our businesses or organization where an employee tried to do XYZ, then we feel and we're it's kind of maybe even egregious. We're just like, oh, we need a policy for that. And that's just kind of an automatic reply to that. But really, if you're thinking about this policy and you're writing this policy with this one particular person in mind, that's not something you want to write a policy for. You don't need blanket statements for those type of situations. This is where you have that tough conversation, but all it's going to do is make you do a lot of extra work. The employee, if they're not following it, are probably not going to follow it anyway. So you'll have to go about, dealing with that on a discipline level side. But you're just going to make it harder for yourself and for your other employees. So don't worry about covering every single little detail.
So, Sherry, to kind of follow on that, I guess my question would be is, and I've kind of heard it both ways, is it better for the employer, for the handbook to be more general in some of its policies, right? I mean, you don't want a policy for every single little thing, that you can think of, but on the policies you are putting in place, is it better to be more general, like, hey, we need to sit at your desk, not we need to sit on the left side of the desk or the right side of the desk, right? what what gives more latitude to the employer or protects them more, because the handbook is really about, how do we build a structure for our organization and our employees. So is it better to be more general, not vague necessarily, but more general in the application of the policies or what's in the handbook, or is it better to be very specific about this is the way it has to happen?
Um, there's a couple schools of thought, but I think overwhelmingly we want to be more vague in our policies. We want a little bit more wiggle room. That gives employers the opportunity to make decisions and on the fly, and not to rule out fair and consistency, because that's still the key. But is something sitting on your left side of your desk really that big of a deal? And if it's not, then do we really want something that would say something so drastic that we'd have to do some sort of discipline, that type of stuff? I think when you're talking specifics to make sure that you have the details of the law that you would get as an employer would get into trouble if something were not done correctly. But on your generalized policies, things like how do you dress, or, what is your interaction with other employees going to look like? You want to keep that more general and vague and keep those issues to just those conversations with employees if things do come up. You don't want to just lock yourself in as an employer and have to follow a ton of rules and regulations that may not make a big deal in the end. Does that help?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
All righty. There are different considerations for handbooks and how you want to structure them. And I've got three pretty easy ones. I'm going to give you some pros and cons. The first one is just the core. It's an all-in-one structure. It's easy to administer to new employees because every employee is going to get the same new handbook. You're just going to, maybe pass it out or send it to them. It allows for uniformity. Even if you have employees in other states, you might take the most stringent state regulations and make everybody go by those. While it may be not as cost efficient to you, it may be easier administratively, and so it just allows for that uniformity. And then the cons of that is if you have employees in multiple states, you have to consider making sure that you're not only covering the state that your business is in, but you're covering every regulation or state that you may even have remote employees in. So if you have, Missouri, your company's in Missouri, but you also have a remote employee in Illinois, they have a few more regulations that you're going to have to look at that Missouri doesn't have, and you're going to have to make sure to add those. Um, again, following different rules in different states, unless you take your most stringent one and kind of adopt that, you're going to have to keep updating those different rules in those different states, which can become pretty complex and burdensome over time. And then sometimes it's complicated on how to create them and know when and how to update them because you're trying to work with so many different state structures. Another way that you can structure your handbook is just the core and addenda structure. That's something that we use here at EDP. We have our core structure, which is because we're based in Missouri and most of our employees come from Missouri. So they're all under that one main structure. But we have a few remote employees. And so we'll have an addenda for Colorado. We'll have an addenda for Tennessee. We'll have an addenda for Oregon, whatever states that we may have remote employees in. When you do use this core and addenda, it allows for a shorter core handbook and it's easy to update usually when you're hiring into a new state, because then you can just add the addenda for the new state and you're not going to be changing that core all the time. There's a con though, if your employees have to flip back and forth between a core handbook and an addenda, they can compare benefits. And so if one state you have to have maybe a certain number of hours of paid sick leave, and another state it's a lesser amount, that person in the state with a lesser amount may feel a little slighted and may be concerned and may bring it to your attention. Well, how come I don't get as much as they do? And you'll have to address those things. And then the third way that you could do this is to do a state specific structure, which is pretty nice for the employees because that's the only part they have to worry about. So they don't have to worry about, anybody else in any other state that they have to work through those handbooks for. They can't really compare benefits across states. So you can save money possibly because you're not giving 56 hours of paid sick leave when in their state, maybe they only get 40 hours of paid sick leave, things of like that nature. And of course, things are easy to update by state, but it can be larger administrative burden if you are in multiple states and managing different entitlements for the employees across the states. Just keeping track of who gets what amount of paid sick leave. And I keep using paid sick leave because I know we dealt with that last year, and that's kind of a good, easy example. But it's those benefit things that are really coming into play with that.
Sure, before you move on, I do have a couple of questions. Leslie had asked a question about they're going to hire their first hybrid employees based or living in Illinois. They're going to report obviously to the main office in Missouri, but I think you've addressed this part of it as far as they need to take into account Illinois employment laws in there.
Yes.
And, developing an addendum to their core handbook for the Illinois, specifically Illinois employment laws specifically in there. And, is that something that we can help them out with as far as trying to structure that, give them the information, structure that addendum to that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have a platform that we use here at EDP that we subscribe to. They are amazing with law updates and getting the information to us, and we can go pull information for every state and what specific laws are in that state that you have to worry about. So yeah, definitely, we can help you with that. No worries.
Are there any states that are mandating that if your employer is in a different state, but the employee, like, let's just use Missouri and California. Is there any state that, like, say, EDP is in Missouri, we hire somebody in California. Is there a state, I'm not saying California specifically, but an example of, do they say specifically that, no, you have to have a separate handbook just for all employees in California? Even though you're based in Missouri, you have your one for Missouri staff, but then you have to have a separate
Right.
one. Are there any states
No,
mandating that?
I haven't seen that yet. I still think they're letting employers structure their handbooks as they need to. But that employer, sorry, that California employee would not only be under some Missouri laws, but you would have to make sure to account for all of those laws in California as well, and make sure that you are giving them all the entitlements and benefits that they are supposed to get as an employee. So.
last question on that topic for you. Just your opinion on this as an HR professional. Electronic versus old school paper handbooks.
Yeah.
And because we're talking about, addendums and updating and, when you have updates and if you're reviewing it every year, what have you. Do you find that in your experiences so far that it works better electronically or paper copy to track or maintain or whatever you want to call it?
Well, my opinion, electronic updating is the best, and electronic dissemination has been very beneficial. You're saving the environment. You're not having to worry about printing and that kind of stuff, as long as you have a centralized location where employees can get to that information and get to it easily, or you're sending it to them and then just sending them any new things. That works well. But don't discount paper copies either, because I know while the younger generation has a lot, they can take this stuff in electronically and it's nothing to them. Older employees like myself, sometimes we want to be able to print things out, that type of stuff. And so you may just want to take into consideration your population, maybe give them a choice. So if you have an older population, you might ask them, would you like a printed um, employee manual, or do you want one online? Or give them the option, if it is online, that they can print it themselves. So just give them the option, because the goal is to make sure they understand what is happening in your company and what they're supposed to do. So you want to get it to them as efficient for them as possible.
Perfect.
So yeah. All right, so there are different components of employee handbooks. I've separated in 10 sections, and some of these we'll go through real quick, but I think they make excellent employee handbooks to have a little bit of each of these sections in there. So when you start, this is where you're introducing your company. Again, with that tone, this is where you're going to see that shine through. You're going to start with the introduction, which is the welcome to the company. Maybe give them a little history and background of your company, which will get them a little more familiar with you. Give them the purpose of the handbook. Like, what are they supposed to use the handbook for? So they understand, oh, this is where I'm getting all my rules and my procedures. Maybe tell them your mission, tell them your vision. You might have an organizational chart in there, and that is fine as well. Whatever will kind of get them familiar with your company. And then here are some things in the equal employment opportunity section. We're going to talk about these real quick because I know we're bumping up on some time now, but there are certain things that you need to make sure. If you have one or more employee, you're going to have an equal opportunity statement. And that's about those protected characteristics, that you're not going to discriminate against race or gender, religion, age, things like that. So you want to make sure that you have that in there. But as an addendum, not as an addendum, but as a side note to you all, if you were not aware, Missouri has a Human Rights Act. And what it is basically the equal opportunity statement, but they've expanded it. So they include things like HIV, AIDS protections in there. And so if you're in Missouri, you don't have to necessarily put both of those laws in there separately, but you want to make sure that your equal opportunity statement combines everything that's federally mandated along with the Missouri mandates. And you should know that different states have different expanded characteristics. So you may want to look up, if you have remote employees in different states, make sure all of those expanded characteristics are in there as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. The immigration compliance law. This you might take or leave most of the time before we give somebody an employee handbook. We're going to make sure that they are able to work in the United States. We're going to have done the I-9. We're going to have maybe done E-Verify if that is something that we do as a company. And so this one is kind of up to you if you want to put it in or not. It's never going to hurt you. So background checks, you're going to want to address this. Again, a lot of times when we make sure that we are doing background checks, we're going to do that before somebody gets a handbook. However, background checks is also one of those things that we kind of keep on the forefront, because if you don't know, when you do background checks, you have to have authorization to run background checks on people as part of the Fair Credit Standard reporting Fair Credit Reporting Act, sorry. And so you want to make sure that you have something that gives you authorization that they have signed that says this is how that you are able to do this background check. And you're going to keep those signed things in files or on digitally if you do everything digitally. Some I've seen applications that have that information and authorization on applications where they'll check it and they'll sign it, keep those as well. And just as a side note, if you do a lot of background checks and you're an EDP client, we go through National Crime Search, and you have the ability to go on our website and do your background checks through National Crime Search. Also, they do the authorization digitally, so they have all of that. You can just download that to keep that in your files, and they do the background checks. They're very fast and efficient. There's a lot of different types of background checks they do, and you will get a discount since you are an EDP client. I don't know how much the discount is, but I do know you'll get a discount. So if you want to check that out, let us know. We can show you where to go to get that taken care of. You'll want a contractual disclaimer and an at-will statement. Contractual disclaimer is, again, this is not creating an employment contract. This does not say that you will be employed in this company for this amount of time or at this specific job or anything like that. You just want to make sure that they understand that the handbook is not a contract. And the at-will statement, it's important to know with the at-will statement what level of at-will your state has, because levels of at-will change in different states. And without going into that too much, just know what your at-will for your state includes. For example, if you have somebody in Montana or you are based in Montana, at-will only applies for the first 6 months of employment. So know what those are. But there are actually a lot of states that have some sort of at-will. Just know the different regulations of those. Reasonable accommodations. If you have 15 or more employees, you have to be concerned with these on a federal and state level. If you have 15 or more, you have disability accommodations. Those are those ADA compliance measures. Pregnancy accommodations. Just as another side note, Kansas City, if you have 6 or more employees, you have to have pregnancy accommodations as part of something that you are following. So you'll want to get that in your handbook. And then religious accommodations as well at 15 or more employees. So you'll have a general employment practices and policies section. This is where you'll have those standard ones that you're used to seeing or hearing about, like sexual harassment and other unlawful harassment. You'll have your drug and alcohol policy in there. Make sure that you're protecting your employees and your clients and your business with those best practice, just best practice. If you are a business of one or more, you have to have something about violence in the workplace. That's an OSHA thing. And you need to include language. You don't need to. I would think it would be best practice to include language, not only include the workplace, but how many issues of violence actually began at the bar or actually began at somebody's barbecue, or, maybe it became, a soccer game for their kids. Making sure not to bring that stuff into work. So you may want to not just talk about it as far as on your workplace premises, but maybe address, don't bring outside issues into work, and put that as part of your policy as well. Weapons in the workplace. Again, it's best practice. It's going to protect your company. There is a federal legal policy of no weapons anywhere in the workplace. But Missouri, again, has its own little policy that speaks to employees being able to store their weapons in their cars or their trucks that may be on your present premises as they come to work. If you do include the Missouri thing, you need to do, probably put them in tandem, and then it spells it out specifically what your requirements are as far as can they have those things in their cars in your parking lot. You're going to want to cover complaint procedures. If they have issues, where do they go? Who do they talk to? How do they handle that? Along with your federal reporting and anti-retaliation policy, which means that they're not going to get in trouble for having complaints or telling things that you should know that may be in violation of law. And Missouri, again, has its own whistleblower act. If you have 6 or more employees, you will need to include that policy in this section. And it's all about not having retaliation from your employer if you're reporting things that are against the law. You'll also want to talk about, just real quickly, your introductory period so they know how long that is. Your employment classifications, those are covered by the Fair Labor Standard Act, like exempt, full-time, part-time, temporary, any classifications of employees that you have. And then personnel records, this is something that's coming. It was actually in a bill, I'm going to say last session, but it was kind of killed in committee. It was attached to several other laws. So while not set up as legal yet in Missouri, employers in a lot of states across the country have the ability to access their personnel records, and you just have to have a procedure that tells them how they get that information. So since we've seen it once already, I am not, I'm sure we'll see it again, and at some point it may get passed. So you might want to just be thinking about that ahead of time. All right, anytime you have something that you want to maybe have inspection and searches, if it's lockers, desk, that kind of stuff, you're going to want a policy about it that outlines that. How far does those inspections and searches extend? What would be the type of things that you would have inspections and searches for? And you just want to break that out so the employee is aware, along with company equipment policies, how to use your company equipment and what the expectations are. Bring your own device policies or dual device policies. So are they using their cell phone? Are they using their own computer for your company, which, brings a lot of risk with it. And because you don't necessarily need all of the company's stuff on somebody's personal devices. So lay out those policies ahead of time. Phone usage, personal cell phone usage, those are good for employees to know. Is it okay that I take a call every once in a while? Or am I okay if I don't have somebody maybe standing in line waiting to check out, or a table waited to be seated, that I check my text messages? Let them know ahead of time what you're expecting. There's social media policies. Who do you want speaking for or about your company? Do you have a specific person, or is anybody allowed to post about your company? Kind of have that laid out, and we'll talk about that a little bit more if we have some time at the end. Personal property. What kind of stuff can you bring with you? Especially in office settings, even just desk decorations can get crazy. What's your standard for that? Can they bring a heater if they're cold, that type of thing? And then where even do they park? Where are they supposed to be? No, let them know that ahead of time. Again, these are simple things, but it will help an employee get adjusted easier to your company and your expectations. Then, of course, you have your code of conduct section, which talks about your attendance. And I think we talk about this quite a bit, but hours of work, what happens if they work off the clock? What happens if there's meal breaks and rest periods? Missouri doesn't require either, and FLSA doesn't require either. Either. I'm getting confused here. But FLSA does say if you do provide rest periods, they must be paid for. So, workplace behavior policies, how do you want them to dress? Are they front facing, or are they just kind of in the back? What kind of information in your business do you want them to remain confidential? Are they able to talk about, hey, that's a client of ours, or is that private information that nobody else should know? So share those things with them that lets them know where the boundaries are, so they're not talking out of turn to somebody else about people in your business. Conflict of interest policies, we're pretty familiar with that. Receiving business gifts, we're pretty familiar with that. I think especially putting a dollar amount on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And then outside employment, Do you want them to be able to have outside employment if they want to, or is that going to be too much of a hardship on your business if they're trying to work two jobs? Knowing that if you put something in there that they can't, you may lose an employee, but that's just a thing that your company has to kind of decide for itself and put those expectations in there so it doesn't become a problem later on if somebody does get a second or third job. Compensation policies, pay periods, pay days, timekeeping. How are they keeping their time? Are they clocking in at a certain place or are they just writing it on a timesheet? Let them know that the overtime. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. I can. Overtime regulations, is it everything over 40 or are you in a state that maybe you get overtime over 8 hours or you get overtime over 12 hours? What if you're in healthcare and it's an 8 and 80 situation? So spell those things out, spell out what type of deductions you are legally allowed to take from their payroll, whether it would be for taxes or if they wanted health insurance and they have a portion that they pay, or it's some sort of pension plan, whatever those things might be, spell those out so they're aware of that. And then expense reimbursements, if they have reimbursements that they are owed, how do they go about getting those reimbursements? Make sure that you address that as well. Then, of course, your benefits section, you'll want to talk about the different medical, dental, flexible spending accounts, group life insurance, disability benefits that come under this medical and health benefits section. What do you have? Let them know so they are more aware of what opportunities they have to have these type of benefits. And then, of course, any type of retirement or service awards, employee referral program benefits, educational assistance programs that your company might offer, or matching gift programs that your company might offer. Let them know what they have that they can take advantage of in your company. Time off and leave of absence. This is where you're going to spell out if you have time off or paid leave. What those are, how many hours they are, how they go about getting those hours and that time off, and how they put in for that. Can they take unpaid time off? Can they, or do they have to use all of their sick and vacation first? Spell that out for them so they know, so there's no question about that. Family medical leave, if you are 50 employees or more, it's a federally mandated. Or if you're a government agency of any type, or you're related to a government agency, you also are underneath that FEMLA. State leave, there are many states that are now offering paid state leave. Right now, there's 23 states and the District of Columbia that have it. And so address those things there, along with any sort of temporary disability leave. In Missouri, we have domestic violence leave and accommodation. And so there are laws around that. And based on how many employees that you have and how much leave that you're able to give them, if they have those type of situations. Military leave, USERA is federal, so you make sure that you have addressed that. But Civil Air Patrol and Coast Guard duty, those are specific to Missouri. So if you have 50 or more employees, you need to make sure those things are in your handbook as well. And then any other type of leave like jury service, witness leave, bereavement leave. If you want everybody to vote and you want to give them time off to go vote, put that in there as well so they understand that. And I think it's real important just to spell these things out because especially, if someone loses someone close to them, you don't necessarily want them having to use their sick leave or their vacation leave when they get bereavement leave. That's a rough time, to go through anyway. So let's not, hinder somebody more than we have to as far as taking leave. Then for health, safety, and security, you'll have a section on that where you talk about your smoke-free workplace, which is a mandatory OSHA requirement, part of the Clean Air Act. What happens if there's an injury and how do they report those? You'll want to cover that. Evacuation plans. You don't necessarily have to have an evacuation plan listed in your employee handbook, but you definitely want to have posters up so people know where to go if they do have to evacuate. Workers' compensation, that's mandated. If you have one or more employee, you need to make sure that you're addressing that, and how they go about, what that looks like if something happens to them. Is there a specific doctor they have to go to? When do they have to report that? That type of thing. Workplace violence and security, again, it's just good practice. Are there safety measures that we use in our business to make sure that we are safe? Do we keep the front door locked? Do we make clients have appointments? That type of stuff. Again, that's going to depend on your business. It's going to depend on the people that you're working with or your public that's coming in. So you spell that out so that they have an idea of that. Driving safety, are they driving for you? Are they going somewhere for business, maybe in their own car or driving in your vehicles? Spell those things out. And texting and driving, it's good to have a policy for that as well. It's just like a best practice for HR. What happens if they get into an accident while they're on the clock or while they're driving for your business? What is the procedure for that? How do they handle that if, they're able to? And then what are your procedures for inclement weather or outages, like electric outages? And are they supposed to come into work, or do they stay home and work from home? That type of thing. And performance and development, you'll have a section that talks about how often they get performance reviews. Most people think after the standard introductory period, they'll get a performance review. A lot of businesses do it annually. You can do it anytime you want. Actually, just spell it out ahead of time so your employees know, hey, I'm going to get, reviewed every quarter. And so they know what the expectation is. And whatever you do is just good practice to maintain that. You want to document work in their work. You want to keep that going. You want to, be able to coach them as necessary. So it's just good to spell that out so they know what to expect. And then progressive discipline policy. If you have a progressive discipline policy, make sure that you're spelling out the steps for that. Like, what are the first and second and third steps? What is the amount of time that you have to turn that around? And add a disclaimer, just best practice, that you are able to skip the steps if the company decides that that is the best way to handle a situation. Those are for the big time things that you might just be like, no, this was too neglectful. We have to just let you go. And employment separation, how do they resign? And what if you help them resign? Spell out those policies. Make sure that you get your possessions and your property returned. Spell out how that looks. And just as a side note, in Missouri, if you don't know, and you terminate someone's employment, you must present them with final pay at the time of dismissal. So don't be holding back. That could get you into a lot of trouble if you are not handing them a check as you're walking them out the door. So make sure that you take care of those things. And then again, I think Jeff talked about this earlier, the handbook receipt, acknowledging that they have the handbook. Make sure that that shows that you did your best to make sure they understood all the rules and laws of not just employment rules and laws, but the policies of your company as well. When you do your updates, are there things that you're updating? If so, make sure that you give them an update so they can re-sign that. Okay. Are you doing trainings each year? Make sure that they're signing that they're doing those trainings each year. All of these things are going to help you have everything that you need if something would come up and you would have a employment lawsuit go against you. This is just further documenting evidence that will help you. As you think about you updating your employee handbook, think about your culture. Maybe when you wrote it, you had 10 employees and now you have 25 employees. Well, your culture should and will change with that. So you want to make sure that it still represents the culture of your organization and not just something that this is how it used to be, but what is it like today? And then ghost policies, if you have policies in there that you're not utilizing because nobody pays attention to it or nobody, has that situation anymore, get them out of there. You don't necessarily need to hold on to those. It's just going to help you out in the end, especially with maintaining your handbook. Jeff, I think we're running up on time, and I don't know if we have time for trending topics or if you wanted to take more questions.
Let's do this. Let's go ahead and go through the trending HR topics. We're recording the meeting, so if somebody has to drop out, that's fine. No worries there.
Oh,
Again, we'll
yes,
have a
please.
recording of the video so that we'll send you guys the link to that so you can catch this last little part of it. We do want to respect everybody's time, but we also
Yes.
think that these are important things that you need to know about and pay attention to that are coming up within the HR world that we're going to need to address at some point. So let's go ahead and do that. And if people are still hanging out and they want to do Q&A after the fact, we can do that. Or if they just want to email them in after we get done with this,
Okay,
either way. So
sounds
we
good.
understand.
Sounds good. Yes. Yeah, don't feel bad if you have to go. We totally understand time limitations here. Um, Sick leave, just so you know, currently 20 states and DC have some sort of sick leave. Also, some cities have mandated sick leave. So again, we talk about this all the time, what starts on the coast usually makes its way to the middle. We had our type of trying to have sick leave last year, and then it was repealed, but these things tend to spread. So be aware of those and be looking for those to make sure that you stay compliant. State paid FEMLA or paid state leave. Again, 23 states and DC have some sort of state paid FEMLA. And so keep an eye on that. I think that might be a little while for Missouri, but I know it is in a lot of others, and they're just continually adding to it. Cell phone and internet usage stipend or reimbursement. This isn't something that we have as a law in Missouri yet, but our neighbor Illinois has it, and currently 11 total states have it. So if you have people that are using their internet to do business, if they're using their cell phone to do business, there's some laws around that. You may need to be reimbursing them or giving them stipend for it. Maybe you have employees that are remote. You may need to look into, are you supposed to be paying them for those in those remote areas, those remote states? AI policies, this is coming about. 7 states have already enacted laws regarding AI in employment. Colorado just passed a very comprehensive law that requires a formal AI risk management policy and program. It kind of beat California in this instance, which was really surprising, but I think as AI expands, there will be some recommendations and some regulations around this that we will have to address, and that you'll want to address specifically as a risk management strategy for your business. Pay transparency laws, 15 states plus DC have pay transparency laws. Whenever they have positions to post, they have to post what the range of the salary is. It is coming. It's just, taking its time, but be aware of that. And some cases I think it might help bring in applicants if they know what the range is also. So it may be good to do that anyway, but know whether you're required or not, because there have been a lot of lawsuits based on not being transparent about what salary ranges will be. I've seen quite a bit of that.
Actually, I
Um,
think Sherry, in Colorado,
yeah,
they actually it's a law that you have to in Colorado it's a law they have to post the ranges because of the discrimination between gender pay ranges between male and female. And so it is
yeah,
in that
and
direction.
that's one of the reasons they have pay transparency laws, is because they're wanting to eliminate anything that could be misconstrued or could be used not in a good way. Like we're going to pay a man, or we might pay a woman more to do a certain job. So yeah. Um, Protected characteristics, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Yes, federally, there are those characteristics, but and Missouri has the HIV and AIDS expansion on that, but there are actually 24 states that have expanded their protected characteristics. So look at the protected characteristics of the states that you're based in or that you might have employees in, and make sure that you're getting all of those under your equal opportunity commitment. Non-competes, we talked about that. And currently 40 states have enacted specific statutory restrictions or full bans on non-competes. So again, we are not in that right now for the state of Missouri, but 40 others have. So we need to be looking at that if we are in different states and making sure that we are covered in those. And then employee privacy, and this goes back to what we were talking about with regards to social media, that type of thing. A lot of law has been coming up in different states regarding employee privacy. And not only do we have the privacy of, hey, you don't have to be microchipped if you don't want to, but you can't, in a lot of states, you can't expect an employee to give you their social media I guess, handle or whatever, so that you can watch the stuff that they're posting. You have to give them written explicit notification before you monitor their electronics, emails, internet usage. There are obviously biometric privacy laws about fingerprints, facial scans, other biological identifiers. Things are kind of moving that way, that we want the ease of making sure that the people that are clocking in are the people that are supposed to be clocking in. So we've started to bring about some of those biometric things. But people still have rights in a lot of places, and so make sure that you're not violating their privacy in that. There's also been a lot of law wrapped around lifestyle discrimination lawsuits for how people act off work premises. This has really come about in the last couple of years as we've had some really hot topic, controversial issues in the United States, that states are wanting to protect employees and their lifestyles and their behavior off premises, maybe not to have any say in how they are at work, or getting reprimanded at work because they did something that the boss may not have liked, or they posted something the boss may not have liked, that type of situation. So be sure to watch for that in your states that you are based in, or you have remote employees in. And I think we are now to the question section.
Yeah, absolutely. um, just real quick, just a couple questions. How effective are the employee signatures of acknowledgement and of the handbook? Like how effective is that really if it goes to court? I mean, how?
I understand what you're asking, because how do you know if somebody signs a paper that says, yes, I've received and acknowledge, or I've received and read? How do you know that they really read it? And that's going to be hard to prove. But what you're doing as an employer is you are proving due diligence. Hey, I made sure to give this employee the handbook. I made sure to make sure that they knew they were supposed to read it. If they had questions, they were supposed to ask. I have their signature that said that they did that, they acknowledged it. And what it does is just kind of protects your business, because it puts some onus on the employee themselves. And it's kind of then on them. If they didn't read it and they signed that they read it, that's kind of their issue. And so that might buy you some protection if you have a disgruntled employee who's filing a lawsuit against you. So it's important.
Okay, good to know. Leslie has a question about expanding a little bit on the paying employee at the time of termination. Is it just for resignations? Is that for resignations and terminations, or just involuntary terminations? And additionally, is the day of, meaning the end of the day, or as you terminate them? Like, is it like if somebody's resigning and they give you their resignation date, you obviously want to make sure they're paid, obviously through their last date of work. Where I think the tricky thing comes into is terminations, when you're going to terminate somebody, and ensuring that they're paid either when they walk out the door, or they have, and correct me if I'm wrong, if they have agreed to receive their last paycheck direct deposit. deposit, but they have to agree to that if you're going to terminate them. But if you're terminating them on the spot, you have to hand them a check when they walk out the door. That doesn't mean you can't take deductions out of that check for stuff that they still owe you out of that last paycheck, but they have to be paid when they walk out the door so that the relationship is then complete at that point in time. You can't hang on to their paycheck for another 2 weeks before you actually pay them, um, unless it's agreed upon beforehand. If you say, hey, we're going to terminate you on Friday, you know, do you want to go in direct deposit? It's a possibility. But by and large, that's not usually the way it happens. So yes, you do need to be handing them a check when they walk out the door for the wages up to that time frame, if I'm not mistaken.
You are not mistaken. I feel like you answered the question. If
I will take
somebody's
the win.
resigning, you can they don't necessarily have the right to expect being paid on their very last day if they're voluntarily resigning and not being a forced resign, because we know that happens too, but voluntarily, like hey, I'm heading back to college and so I'm going to put in my 2 weeks. You can pay them when that next pay date comes, and that's a reasonable expectation. But it is when you're forcing people out, when you are letting them go, you do need to be paying them that day. It says that day. The interpretation in many cases has been that you have to pay them as like as you're terminating them. I don't know that to be specifically like spelled out. If you have a direct deposit and it will be in their bank account that day, I don't know the wiggle room on that. So, but I would say, so I don't want to legally advise you, but best practice is be handing them that paycheck on their way out the door. I think then you're covered both ways. So I hope that's helpful.
Heather had a question, but just so you guys know, I've given you guys the ability to unmute yourself. So please feel free that if I mutilate the question, please feel free to step in and ask the question the way you mean it. Heather, you guys have, your question is, would you have an employee handbook that's 60 plus pages? Most of the time, the employees sign it without having really truly read it. Would you recommend sharing a shorter version of that handbook for employee reference, such as like an FAQ sheet? And if you do that, what's the implications of doing that if something goes south?
Um, Heather, I guess my first thought would be look at your analyze your 60 pages of your handbook. Are there things in there that are policies mixed in with things that are procedures? And a lot of times, if there's policies and procedures, and the procedures aren't necessarily mandated by the state or federal, but they're procedures specifically within your company, sometimes you can actually separate those out and have a policy manual. It will be much shorter, it'll be much cleaner, and you'll have your easier for your employees to take on, and then do the procedures as a separate manual that they can use when they need to access, oh, how do I go about doing XYZ? I think that would make it a little easier. The other thing you might analyze too is, I know sometimes on policies, especially when we get templates of policies, I mean, they're long. I mean, they're super involved. Is there a way to maybe make a small paragraph or summarize a policy and then just put a statute number? Like, if you want to see more about this law, visit Missouri statute, 541 or whatever statute that you're referencing. That gives them an opportunity, if they want to dig into something more, that they can go read more specific. You've given them a short little snippet about it. That can also help you as far as shortening your actual policy manual. On an FAQ, I like the idea. I'm trying to wrap my brain around what it would look like. I think it would be helpful. And then maybe again, with maybe those links of where they can go out and see more specifically about it. So, even if it's just something in your handbook, and you do an FAQ, and then for more information, visit 5.7 in your employee manual. I like that idea. I would still make sure that you do have something specific in an employee manual that you're referencing, or again, a statute that they can look up. But I like that. That's very creative. So That's kind
Cool.
of a great idea.
Cool.
Thank you, Sherry. That's super helpful.
Good, 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 good.
Jerry, one of the things that I think is one of those, HR topics to pay attention to is how to, with the continued legalization of certain drugs, like or say marijuana, for example, right? So that's becoming more and more deregulated. Obviously, on the federal level, it still is. State level is a different story. While you can have a policy that they can't use illegal drugs or alcohol on premise, is it like how does an employer address that if an employee already comes into the organization? I mean, alcohol, I think, is something probably has already been addressed for years, right? If somebody comes
Right.
in intoxicated. But with now the legalization of marijuana, recreational use, how do we address that as employers? If somebody comes in already under the influence of marijuana, how do they address that in the employee handbook? I mean, that's kind of one of
Yeah.
those, they didn't do
That's
it
a
on
good,
premise,
yeah.
but what do you do with it?
That's a good question. And not only do you have certain states, like Missouri and Colorado, that you have, legalized recreational marijuana, but there are also states that have legalized some psychedelics as well. So make sure that you know what states that you are addressing your alcohol and drug issue or policy in. We have to work because they're legal. Usually when we write a policy, we say illegal drugs. That's the way we've done it for years. And so in our brains, all drugs are illegal, but now they're not. Now they're legal drugs. And so you want to address them as legal drugs, and you want to address them the same way that you would if somebody had a prescription of something that they were allowed to take, that, maybe a narcotic or something of that nature. You want to make sure that they are not under the influence. So I would put something in specifically about even legal drugs not coming in under the influence or anything that would alter their ability to do their jobs effectively and safely. And I know there's a lot of wiggle room in that because they might say, "Oh no, I'm fine. I'm just fine." And you're just like, "Okay, you're not fine because you bumped into three walls on your way in here." But you're going to want to address that from a legal drug standpoint. And I will tell you federally, I know that there are doctors that do prescribe psychedelics, narcotics. They do prescribe medical marijuana use, but that is not a protected anything federally yet. So even if it's prescribed, that's not an ADA accommodation. And so you can still have your policy. And then once you have it in policy, make sure, if somebody comes in, follow your policy. You also want to make sure that you're being fair and consistent. So if Joe comes in and you can see that he is inebriated or he is high from, coming to work and reporting to work that way, that you follow the same steps and protocols that you would if Susan did it. Because what happens is, if Joe goes to court or Susan goes to court, you're going to be able to look back and say, no, we followed XYZ. That's the fair and consistency, and that's going to protect your company. So, but yeah, definitely address the legal drugs because that is becoming kind of an issue, a hot button issue. That's a good question.
Okay, let me check and see if we got anything else out there. I don't see any other questions out there in the Q&A or in the chat. Obviously, if you guys need or want more information, Sherry's contact information is there. Like I said, we're going to send out a copy of the slide deck, the Q&As, a recording of the meeting. We do have an HR services department within the organization, so we definitely can help you with anything that's been covered today on how to set up handbooks and how to help set some of these policies and those types of things for you guys. So please feel free to reach out to Sherry, and she will get you guys taken care of as far as that goes. So if there are no other Q&As, I think I know we ran over a little bit. We do appreciate you guys hanging out.
Thank you for your time.
So important to make sure we get this thing right. Because like Sherry said, at the beginning of the webinar, 40%, that's a lot. of small businesses are in some sort of lawsuit about employment, and we want to make sure you guys have all the right tools to make sure you're covered as far as that goes. So it is important to know that stuff. So, anyways, we do appreciate your time. We thank you guys for coming. But
Thank you.
yeah, we're good. All right.
Yeah.
You guys back
Have a
again.
great rest of your day,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.